Hey team, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you all so much for being here. Some time ago I did a more long form video breaking down the contents of the Picatrix, and in that video I said Book 4 Chapter 4 is actually another really great chapter that I'll probably do a whole separate video on, which is just great. And so a big thank you to Past Ryan for providing work for me to do now, in the future. I really appreciate you looking out, Past Ryan, instead of like, I don't know, doing it then. So now it's come time to sort of fulfill this promise, and I wanted to take the time to sit down and break down these aphorisms that I referred to in the video but didn't, of course, actually break down because the video was already getting too long. The Picatrix is a text from the 950s that serves as the sort of primary handbook for contemporary astrological magical practice. And the book contains in it a lot of information and a lot of wisdom, but also a lot of craziness. And if you're maybe unfamiliar with the contents of the Picatrix, I really recommend going and watching that more long-form video that I did, Not Your Mama's Book of Shadows, as it goes through and pulls out a lot of the more like useful astrological magical information and kind of separates it from some of the weirder contents of the Picatrix. So definitely go and check that out. But today we are going to talk about the aphorisms that are within Book 4, Chapter 4. And a lot of these aphorisms are sort of very basic and easy to understand, but others are a little bit more interesting or unique, or kind of have some like unique flavor to them that are worth kind of talking about a little bit more in depth. But before we get started, what is an aphorism? Why are they important? Why do we have them? Why are we talking about them? Basically, an aphorism is like a cute little saying that reflects some sort of general truth. We actually have them a lot in traditional astrology. There are some even like collections of aphorisms that became somewhat popular. One of the more popular ones is the Centiloquium of Pseudo-Ptolemy, or like the Book of Fruit, and it contains 100 sayings, that's what Centiloquium means, that are in some cases forms of advice for the astrologer, and other cases more like interpretational guidelines. So one of the popular aphorisms is like, don't elect a time unless you know what you're electing for, which is like, yeah, that checks out. But that's an aphorism. Some tend to be more like advice based, and others are a little bit more like technique based. And the Picatrix is a little bit of both. So Book 4, Chapter 4 starts us off telling us that this set of aphorisms comes from Mercurius from Babylon, and contained in his book, The Secret of Secrets. And we're told that there are 45 aphorisms, and we're not going to cover them all in one video. So we're going to split this up into two different videos. I'm going to do 22 and 22. And I know you're saying, hey, that doesn't equal 45. And I know, but there's a reason why. So our first aphorism is, if you work from things pertinent to a planet and use these things liberally, and the nature of your ritual is also pertinent to the nature of the planet, then truly you will have the greatest assistance in attracting the fortitude, power, and potency of that planet. And this is just a pretty typical idea in astrological magic, where the focus is on gathering things that are similar to that planet, gathering what were called synthemata, or tokens of that planet. And the more that you have, the more the attention of the planet you're able to get. So I often think of it as sort of like the Eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. The ring bearer becomes the focus of Sauron's attention when they wear the ring. And so it's kind of like that. The more synthemata you have, the more of that planet's gaze or power you're able to kind of tap into. And this is where things can get a little hairy, I think, to some degree, because it really seems like the object of the game is to get as much as you can. But I don't really think that that's necessary. I think a little goes a long way, but I have found personally something that's very helpful is to diversify a little bit in what you have. So like one metal, one gem, one plant kind of a thing. I usually try to work in that sort of framework as much as I can. And that's brought me a lot of success, and also saved a lot of money, because finding, I don't know, man, some things don't come cheap, is what I'm going to say. The next several aphorisms, aphorisms 2 to 7, focus primarily on the powers of the planets and what it is that you would go to them for in particular rituals. Aphorism 2 starts out with, entreat the sun that you may be feared and have glory, the leadership of armies, a splendid heart, the rule of nobles, the destruction of kings, the lighting of fire, and the power to bring light into the darkness. And these are all very solar kind of ideas or concepts. The like being feared, which kind of goes more into how a this is actually something that I would think of as a little bit more descriptive of the sun as a combustor for other planets. So we know that when a planet gets too close to the sun within 7.5 degrees, it combusts that planet. That planet becomes combust. It's invisible. And the idea is that the sun sort of like takes over for that planet. And a lot of times, especially in like horary or even in natal charts, there is the idea that some figure, often like a father figure, controls that aspect of that person's life for some time. It doesn't have to always be that, but there's always like some figure that is like very controlling over like whatever that planet represents for that person. Or like in horaries, it can be if the ruler of the first house is combust, then like, again, there's somebody else involved that is keeping the querent from acting as they want or as they normally would in that situation. That's usually something that needs to be kind of explored more. So that's sort of like the feared part of it. Like you can go to the sun to be feared. Like tapping into the sun is like combustor. Obviously, the sun has associations with glory, with leadership that you can go to. Having a splendid heart is kind of a weird... That's something that I can see translated a couple of ways. First, obviously, the sun has familiarity with the heart in medical astrology. There's an association there. But also just the idea of like being pure of heart in some way, or like having, a good heart. That I think the sun also goes for, because the sun at its most pure, I guess we could say, is more about like truth and honesty and clarity and insight, which I think that could come through more. The rule of nobles, destruction of kings, lighting a fire, and bringing light into darkness, of course, are things that the sun does. The rule of nobles, the destruction of kings, the sun not only being like the significator of leadership as a concept, but also the significator of leaders, is what we're leaning into there. And then bringing light into the darkness. Of course, the sun illuminates, and that goes back to what I was explaining before about the sun, where its powers are primarily like understanding, clarity, seeing, vision. Bringing light, bringing understanding, insight into darkness, things that we don't understand or that are hidden from us or obscured in some way. The sun is very helpful for. So our third aphorism reads, "Entreat the moon for agility of movement, the flow of waters, the power of revealing secrets, the extinguishing of fire, the lessening of burdens to be overcome, and the separating of united opinions." And I think this is a kind of an odd selection of things to kind of emphasize for the moon. I probably would have chosen other things, not that these are not accurate depictions of like powers the moon does, but they just seem a little off-label in some ways. So we have things that focus on the moon's speed, agility of movement. That's going to be good for the moon because she's the fastest moving planet of the 7 traditional planets. And we also see connection with the moon and water, of course, through the moon's connection with the tides and the oceans that we see a lot symbolically in astrology and, of course, like, in like physics. So this is where we get the idea of like, oh, she alters the flow of waters and she can diminish fires. Perfect. Like, we love that. Fire extinguishing, excellent. Let's do it. Call in the fire department. I mean the moon. But some of her other powers, I think, focus a little bit more on kind of the dual nature of the moon, to where you work with the moon differently when she's waxing than you would when she's waning. And so when we're talking about like diminishing burdens, or like dividing united opinions, this is the moon as a waning figure. This is the moon separating. This is the moon diminishing, the moon reducing, the moon getting rid of things in her waning power. And so oftentimes I think about the moon not necessarily as like one united planet, but sort of as like two planets or two sides of this planet, in a way that's more easily observable with the moon because of her distinct waxing and waning phases than with like other planets. Our fourth aphorism reads, "Entreat Saturn for delaying movement, concealing purity, destroying cities, humbling hearts, and calming waters." So this one we're really focusing on Saturn's powers as a malefic planet. The ability to block, to obstruct, to slow down are all things that Saturn is very much known for. And so we see that a lot. Calming waters, humbling hearts, kind of like making people eat humble pie, we'll say, eat crow, which is actually kind of funny now that I think about it because crows are a bird typically associated with Saturn. And delaying movement, destroying cities, all that is pretty well within Saturn's like more malefic powers and tendencies, and we can go to Saturn for those things if we want to. Our fifth aphorism says, "Entreat Jupiter for the accumulation of wealth, the enhancement of dreams, the pleasure of escaping sadness, the leaving behind of toil and quarrel, and safe journeys by land or sea. And this really just taps into Jupiter's power as a benefic, kind of in the same way, kind of the other side of the coin as it did with Saturn as a malefic. Here, Jupiter is said to bring us money, to bring us good dreams, to help us escape from sadness and depression, from hard work, from tough labor and fights, into, you know, something more happy and healthy, and to give us safe journeys by land and sea. Jupiter is a really neat planet to work with in astrological magic. Of course, the gifts and the money and the health and all that is great. But one sort of underappreciated power of Jupiter is, I think, its focus on stability and its ability to provide the right kind of environment that fosters the kind of growth that helps you like get where you're trying to go, which is something that I think is, like I said, it's a little understated, a little overlooked, I think, and sort of like the impact that it can have on people. Our sixth aphorism is entreat Mars for conquering enemies, emboldening the heart, tracking and hunting harmful animals, setting fires, war planning, and conquests over enemies. So for Mars, we're gonna like beating up our enemies so much. We're gonna mention it twice. First of all, we're gonna conquer our enemies and then conquest over our enemies. So we're gonna cover all of our bases, which is super great. But here again, we're leaning into Mars's nature as a malefic planet, as a divider, as a conqueror, as something that takes power over another, rather than something that seeks to work with or, you know, escape from, like we saw in Jupiter's. Somebody who's like, no, you and I are going to fight and I'm going to win. And you can absolutely use Mars powers for that, like the ability to overcome an enemy, to put somebody in their place. Also Saturn, the humbling of hearts, mention putting somebody in their place, knocking somebody down a peg. All of those things Mars or Saturn are very good with. But I think what's interesting here is also like the emboldening of hearts part that we see with Mars, where it's also about like bringing somebody courage, giving somebody the strength to overcome hardship. You can also go to the Sun for that, I think, but Mars is a little bit more of a direct sort of like conflict. This is going to happen, so you might as well be ready for it, kind of a thing, like teaching somebody to box. I think that's where Mars is going to go, whereas the Sun is going to make you feel better, more confident in your own ability to handle it. Our seventh aphorism is to entreat Venus for the union of desires, the power of causing joy and friendship, driving out idleness and grief, for invigorating the appetite, augmenting procreation, multiplying suns, extinguishing fires, and remaining secure from animals. So for Venus, we're leaning much more into her kind of natural significators. Not only is she a benefic planet, but she's a planet that's much more focused on like the body, fertility, having more children, creating, you know, joy, creating connection and relation. That's what she likes to do, helping to drive out idleness, helping us overcome grief. A lot of these are things that Venus likes to do. She likes to replace negative emotions with more positive emotions, help people to overcome grief. I think the idleness aspect of it is a little odd, personally. Because I think that Venus kind of like naturally signifies idleness to some extent. She's not like a very hardworking planet, and I don't mean that bad. But I just have never thought about Venus as like a gotta get up for work on Monday kind of a thing. Like, let's go to Venus, let's get there. But her powers to like bring safety from fire and animals is, of course, like her as an anti-Mars agent to some extent. But you see a lot of her kind of natural powers being referenced in this. Typically, this would be where we would have Mercury's aphorism in the text, but there is no Mercury aphorism. It's just gone. It's just skipped. So we only have 44 out of the 45 aphorisms that the text tells us we should have. But for Mercury, what would you go to a Mercury talisman for? Well, Mercury could be very helpful for communication, for writing, for making sure that like paperwork gets filed correctly, to assist in like speeding up bureaucratic processes. For travel, safety and travel, of course, for evading, for staying out of trouble, remaining secret, being sly, for any kind of sleight of hand kind of stuff. That's where you would go to Mercury for. That's stuff that Mercury really enjoys doing and can do very well. There is some aspect of like trade and wealth involved with Mercury because of like the transactional nature of Mercury himself, but it's not exactly the same kind of wealth that we would see from like Jupiter, which is more like, here's some money. Mercury is more like, Mercury is more like you have to earn it, usually through commerce, but sometimes through like less honest means, we'll say. So up until now, our aphorisms have been very focused on like one specific planet and the powers that you can go to it for, or like why you should go to this planet to help with what issues. But after this point, the aphorisms kind of change into sort of general magic practicing advice. to do what you will. And some of these have some really interesting nuggets, or some of them are kind of weird, and we're going to talk about them. Our 8th aphorism is, make many suffumigations, maintain perfect belief, fast frequently, utter many prayers, pick worthy places for the ritual, look to the aspects of the planets. These are the fundamentals of magic work. And this sort of lays out some kind of basic ideas that you could incorporate into your own practice or your own routine to get more out of your astrological magical practice. So like, for instance, the ideas of like utter many prayers, make many suffumigations, fast frequently, maintain perfect belief. These are all ideas basically to extrapolate off of, or kind of bounce off of, to find ways to incorporate them in your own kind of daily spiritual practice. So like, burn a lot of incense and recite prayers. This is something that you can do, once daily. Do just light an incense to a certain planet on that planet's day, recite a poem or like a hymn or a prayer to that planet, just to help you connect with that planet. Eat foods that are more associated with that planet during that planet's day. Fasting is, of course, its own big subject that's really difficult to tackle. So I don't really like to think of it as fasting per se, but more like intentional consumption, how and when you consume what that is, and how you can align that to a planet to kind of get that connection with it. And so just that's my take on this aphorism, is it's more about small things you can do as a part of a routine, as a part of like a spiritual routine, as a part of like a meditative routine, or whatever that looks like to you, to kind of get more in tune with the planets so that you get more effect and more connection with them when you go to them for something. The 9th aphorism is, your request will be easily fulfilled if the planet to which the request is made is the lord of your nativity. If not, it will be difficult to bring your request to its deserved end. And now this is a big one, in my opinion, because one question that I get a lot, do you consider the natal chart when you are doing an election? My answer is always the same, yes and no. I know, very helpful. I do, but not usually in the way people think of it. Typically, when people ask me that question, what they mean is something like, if my moon is square the election Saturn, can I do it? Yeah, absolutely you can. What I'm more interested in is like, what are you trying to do? And who are you trying to get to do that? So like, if you're trying to make a Jupiter talisman and your Jupiter is retrograde in Gemini, don't do that. Please don't do that. And if you are someone who has done that, call me. The idea that what I have consistently seen happen is when somebody goes to a planet that's not well in their chart for a magical purpose, like to buy it, like to get a talisman of, or to work with them, it almost 100% of the time goes horribly wrong, and that there are more problems than they usually deal with. So like, if Jupiter in them signifies finances, they'll make a Jupiter talisman, they'll buy a Jupiter talisman, and then bam, here now they owe a whole bunch of money. Just like more money being spent going out the window. So, and this goes back to why. You're going to get more out of planets in your natal chart that do well than you will out of the planets in your natal chart that are not well placed. And that's fine. We all have unique relationships with the planets that are determined in part on how they are in our natal charts, but this is where we go into things like planetary remediation, or skipping over the planets entirely and going to like fixed stars and lunar mansions to figure out how to get what we need without necessarily getting a planet involved. So something to be mindful of. I think this also applies to talisman makers. So like, my Venus is not very well placed. But even for myself, even after all the work that I've done, like with Venus, I would never I would never just openly sell Venus talismans without some sort of like warning attached to them, like, hey guys, so Venus and I aren't always great friends. These talismans might not be super effective. Consider these experimental. So keep that in mind too. Who you're buying talismans from, what talismans are most likely to be useful for you, are going to be determined based on planetary strength in your natal chart.
Hey team, Ryan in editing here. So after a certain point of time, as you'll see in a bit, I started to notice that the sort of translation of the astrological version of the Picatrix I had been using just kind of left me a little bit more confused about what exactly it was talking about. And eventually I would go to cross-reference it with the Warnock-Greer translation, which I think has an advantage over the astrological translation in this regard, that it is, since astrologers were very heavily involved in like the translating process, a lot of the astrological lore or instructions come across much more clearly because they're able to, understand what it's asking about or what it's talking about. So the 10th aphorism in the Porca text says, the power of the planets lies in the spirits that strengthen effects, that modulate qualities, improving or lessening them, and that spread out their powers, and I went on a bit about what I thought that meant because it seemed very unclear. But then in editing now, I'm going back and rereading the Picatrix 10th aphorism, which says, spirits have the power to strengthen the effects of a planet and ameliorate its qualities, or to the contrary, to lessen and worsen its effects and scatter its powers, which is much more clear about what exactly this is talking about. And I wasn't too far off in my initial kind of take on it. But basically, it's just that planetary spirits can operate within certain means when it comes to getting effects from the planetary source. So you can either strengthen a weakened planet, or you can further strengthen a planet that's already strong, or you can weaken a planet that's causing, like maybe a strong planet that's causing problems, or scatter the powers of a weak planet that might be causing powers, just sort of like keep it from being concentrated in one area. And I think this is very helpful. Not only when it comes to like the sort of natal remediation side of things that people get interested in or involved in, but also when it comes to sort of capturing or capitalizing on different transits that might be going over, your natal chart. There's a Jupiter-Venus conjunction coming up soon that will be at the very end of Taurus. And if you have, if you have a natal planet there, then this Jupiter-Venus conjunction can probably be a nice little buff to whatever it is that planet is doing, whether that's, you can use this to sort of strengthen that planet or to modulate it to make it better than maybe it's performing now. Maybe the planet that you have here is something that is actually something that you struggle with, and this Jupiter-Venus conjunction can help to ameliorate it, and that's exactly something that's within the scope of what the planets are able to do. So I wanted to kind of record this kind of quick redo of that, of the aphorism that I talked about when I recorded. And you'll see kind of from this point on, I start to go and reference the two different versions of the Picatrix to get a clearer understanding of what is being talked about.
Our 11th aphorism is, if the ascendant differs from the nature of the request, the petition will never be fulfilled, nor will the prayer ever achieve what is sought. I disagree. I don't think this is necessarily true. So generally, earlier in the Picatrix, we saw information about like how or what ascendants could be good for different things. And so this is basically just saying to stick to that list. And if your petition takes place when the ascendant is not really aligned with that goal, don't expect it to go well. And in some ways, maybe this is like a petition-specific thing, so maybe I'll back off of my hard disagree. But this isn't really something that I think a lot about in like talisman making, just because I'm more focused on like the planet involved than I am the ascendant sign itself. But if maybe you're thinking more along the lines of less astrologically and less elective intensive petitions, then maybe it would be a good idea to make sure that your ascendant remains the same. But in like more intense elections where talismans are going to be made, it's not really something that I focus on a lot. I'm much more interested in just like keeping it from being a square Saturn than I am in making sure that like what I want is a fixed upright ascendant sign. That's just a lot to deal with. Let's not. Our 12th aphorism, images of fixed stars are thought to be more enduring than images of planets with retrograde motions. So this sort of picks up on an idea of the fixed stars being a bit more intense in their ability to make the effects of the talisman or the working permanent. So while in sort of the Aristotelian cosmology, while the planets are considered like perfect, undeteriorating things that can't die or things like that, they can still have alterations in their cycles. They still experience retrograde motion. They still experience uneven movement. Their movement's not uniform. They speed up and slow down. And so there is still something about them that's not like 100% awesome. The fixed stars, on the other hand, they're always in the same place. They move the same rate all the time. They have like a real sense of immortality and impermanence about them than like the planets, which go retrograde, or like the moon, which waxes and wanes. You would probably be able to make a pretty good argument for the sun being more included in the camp of the fixed stars than like the planets in this regard. So like solar stuff, solar talismans would be much more permanent than like the other 6 planets. But this really kind of lays down the law that like, oh, it's the fixed stars that are really where you want to go for stuff that you really want to last. And yeah, I mean, go for it. Our 13th aphorism, if you perform your ritual with a planet assisted by some fixed star of the same nature, it will be more complete and perfect since it will have the strength of the planet and the durability of the fixed star. And this is a very interesting aphorism because normally in the tradition, well, I guess for 2 reasons. The first is that fixed stars fixed star talismans are not something that the Picatrix talks about really at all. There's one ritual to Al-Qaid that's mentioned in one of the chapters, but it's a ritual. There's not really a talisman that's made from it. But overall, aside from this, the Picatrix has very little to say about fixed star talismans. Where we see our tradition of fixed stars come from is a text of the 15 stars, which is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. And in that text, we see the electional rules handed down to us are the moon needs to be with the star on the ascendant or the midheaven. But we don't see a lot of instances or references to like the planets being involved. There's not a lot of, I don't think there's one there's not one that I can think of right now. I'd have to like go back and reread the whole text to verify this. That there's not one mention of a planet and a fixed star being conjoined and making a talisman based on that. But Picatrix in this aphorism seems to suggests that that combination of fixed star and planet is actually very powerful. So I would assume that using this idea, you would take like moon and planet both conjoin the star to get the absolute most out of it. But I remember several years ago, there was a big hubbub on social media about Jupiter being conjoined Spica. And like using that to I don't know, to something, I don't know, for something super cool, I guess. I was never quite sure what the end goal in that was. But this idea of like good planet plus fixed star makes that big good for a long time. That's where we're going to go with it. But that is what Picatrix suggests. That is not something that I've had a lot of experience in because those kinds of combinations are kind of rare, especially since I would imagine you would want to get a planet that's similar to the star, and that's a whole other situation. Our 14th aphorism. When the ascendant, the petition, and the planet stand in a single nature, and you serve yourself with the fixed star therein, your request will be fulfilled easily and be strengthened by the power of the planet. So this, I think, is kind of just a repeat of the first one. Basically just the idea that like if the ascendant sign, the petition, the planet are all sort of united in their nature of what they want to do, and you bring in a fixed star that's also like that, then you're going to get extra ketchup on top. I don't know. You're going to get extra sprinkles. It's going to be extra powerful, extra better, and that's what you should do. But of course, like I said, that's much more difficult to do because you've got to get that extra part involved in it. Because the fixed stars, they don't go very fast. They don't help you. And a planet either conjoins it or it doesn't. Our 15th aphorism reads, know that you will be helped in setting things in motion when the stars of Aquila are rising, and when these stars are falling, you will likewise be aided in effects for putting an end to motion. And this is an interesting aphorism for a couple of reasons. The first is that it mentions a fixed star, and fixed star mentions in Picatrix are very rare. The second is that it mentions stars specifically that aren't a part of the tradition of the 15 Bohemian stars. So like Altair is not, like stars in Aquila are not a part of the stars mentioned in the Hermes text that we draw on the fixed stars tradition in. The Greer-Warnock version of the Picatrix has a different translation to this that I think makes a lot more sense. And it says, the fixed star Altair assists with movement, while Vega helps with rest. So Altair is the alpha star of Aquila. And the difference here between like Aquila between like Altair being about movement and Vega being about rest makes a lot of sense, a lot more sense in my opinion, than just like the stars of Aquila rising or setting as mentioned in the Astral and Porica Picatrix. Because Aquila is, the constellation of Aquila is more like the rising eagle, whereas Vega as a part of the Lyra constellation, or like like the falling vulture, Cadence vulture, is about like going down. So you have Aquila, which the Aquila eagle, which is rising up from the ground, and then the Vega eagle, which is like falling down to the ground, like swooping to snatch up prey. And that makes a lot more, like just visually makes a lot more sense for why one would be associated with motion and the other would be associated with rest or stopping motion. Our 16th aphorism says, diligently study the conjunctions of the planets, for this work is very greatly augmented by them. And in my opinion, I think this is a reference to sometime earlier in the Picatrix where it mentioned that one of the greatest secrets was understanding and knowing the various the effects of the various possible conjunction combinations of the planets. So being aware of like what the moon conjoined Venus can do, but also being aware of like what the moon conjoined Venus conjoined Saturn can do, and how that can impact a working, because that's going to be the foundation of what you're going to be able to get out of it. Your success, your ability to augment reality or like renegotiate fate in some sense is going to be limited to your understanding of what you can get out, what realistically the particular combinations of the conjunctions of the planets can get you. So a little bit of like a common sense aphorism there. Don't try to get good, nice, pleasant, helpful things while the moon is conjoined Mars. That's not really something he's going to be able to do. And having that awareness of like how you can funnel things in the right direction based on those conjunctions is going to get you far. Our 17th aphorism is, in the aspects of the planets, as much as in their conjunctions, the foundations of images consist. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure what the message behind this aphorism is. Part of me thinks that it is kind of a reference to the more kind of occult nature of the images, like where they come from and how exactly they operate, because this is much, much later, but Marsilio Ficino argues that the power of the images that are like associated with the different talismans, the power of those images don't come from like the images themselves, but from the mathematical ratios of the lines that the images consist of. So there's something powerful in the math, basically. There's something powerful in the mathematics behind the art of the image. That's Ficino's argument, basically. And knowing that aspects between planets are also a form of mathematics, they're also a form of like the math behind the art of the night sky, makes me think there might be some sort of like allusion to that, but honestly I'm not 100% sure what that aphorism means, and I would be super interested in hearing other people's opinions of what they think this aphorism is trying to talk about. And our 18th aphorism is, put the significator at the midheaven, in its house or exaltation, and see to it that there is a fortitude on the ascendant. This is a very basic electional technique to get the most out of a moment in time. This is something that you can use not only for talismanic elections, but also for kind of conventional elections, mundane elections I call them, like starting a business or doing this or that, or even in petitions. I think it makes a really nice shortcut towards getting something very good out of a very good placement. So you take a planet, you put it in the midheaven in its exaltation in this house, and that would be sort of the focus planet. So like Jupiter in Cancer or in Sagittarius on the midheaven, perfect. And then if you can get Venus in the ascendant, that's excellent. And that sort of helps with whatever the moon is doing. So there's a kind of common electional technique that if the moon is not doing well at the time, if she's not in a good house, if she's aspecting maybe a planet that's not super awesome, and there's really nothing else that you can do with her, if you put like a nice, strong, fortunate planet in the first house, you can sort of overcome that or help to alleviate that issue that the moon is giving you. And so this would be a really great technique to employ if you're in a similar situation in like a planetary talisman. But I don't think I would go to it for like a fixed star or an election talisman, or like a fixed star or a lunar mansion talisman, because the moon's angularity is so important in those particular types of talisman elections that you can't really like overcome it. But having a benefic planet, having a strong, fortunate planet in the ascendant is always going to get you more out of what is always going to get you a better deal, is always going to get you more power from that talisman or from that petition than you would otherwise. So I know that I opened this video saying that we were going to do 22 and 22, but the next several aphorisms are kind of another planetary set that I think makes more sense to kind of cover them together at the beginning of the next video. So we're going to go ahead and come to a close here. Hopefully this kind of walkthrough of these aphorisms and explanations or talking about them has encouraged you to think a little bit more on these aphorisms and some of the aphorisms coming up and how you can utilize the information that they contain to assist your own magical practice. Like I said, a lot of this information is kind of basic, but there are some interesting nuggets hidden within it that are worth thinking about and considering whether or not they are important or useful for our own practice today. But thank you all so much for being here, and I will see you again in part 2.